Hi scholars, this is the Read Aloud video for How to Read a Poem Part 1. As I said in the directions on your slide, if you want to follow along as you look at your Google Classroom, you can go ahead and click over to that tab now. But I'll also be providing pauses in the video so that you can complete your stop and jots and that you know when to turn back to the text. So it's up to you whether you want to read aloud with me on this screen or to move over to your classwork and follow along there. We're going to get started. So, how to read a poem, Part 1. Reading poetry well is part attitude and part technique. Curiosity is a useful attitude, especially when it's free of preconceived ideas about what poetry is or should be. Effective technique directs your curiosity into asking questions, drawing you into a conversation with the poem. The goal of careful reading is often to take up a question of meaning, an interpretive question that has more than one answer. Since the form of a poem is part of its meaning, for example, features such as repetition and rhyme may amplify or extend the meaning of a word or idea, adding emphasis, texture, or dimension. Questions about form and technique, about the observable features of a poem, provide an effective point of entry for interpretation. To ask some of these questions, you'll need to develop a good ear for the musical qualities of language, particularly how sound and rhythm relate to meaning. This approach is one of many ways into a poem. All right, what I would do is pause the video now so that you have time to annotate and answer your stop and jot. What does the author suggest is a good point of entry or starting place for reading poetry? When you're done with your annotations and your jot, click play on the video again, and we'll start the next section. All right, moving into the next section. Getting started, prior assumptions. Most readers make 3 false assumptions when addressing an unfamiliar poem. The first is assuming that they should understand what they encounter on the first reading, and if they don't, that something is wrong with them or with the poem. The second is assuming that the poem is a kind of code, that each detail corresponds to one and only one thing, and unless they crack this code, they've missed the point. And the third is assuming that the poem can mean anything readers want it to mean. William Carlos Williams wrote a verse addressed to his wife in the poem January Morning. All this was for you, old woman. I wanted to write a poem that you would understand. For what good is it to me if you can't understand it? But you got to try hard. William admits in these lines of poetry is often difficult. He also suggests that a poet depends on the effort of a reader. Somehow a reader must complete what the poet has begun. Again, now's the chance to pause, annotate, and answer your stop and jot. What are the 3 false assumptions that you should avoid when reading poetry? When you're done answering, click play on the video again, and we'll move on to the next section. All right, next section. This act of completion begins when you enter the imaginative play of a poem, bringing it to your experience and point of view. If a poem is play in the sense of a game or a sport, then you enjoy that it makes you work a little, that it makes you sweat a bit. Reading poetry is a challenge, but like so many other things, it takes practice, and your skills and insight improve as you progress. Literature is, and has always been, the sharing of experience, the pooling of human understanding about living, loving, and dying. Successful poems welcome you in, revealing ideas that may not have been foremost in the writer's mind in the moment of composition. The best poetry has a magical quality, a sense of being more than the sum of its parts. And even when it's impossible to articulate this sense, this something more, the power of the poem is left undiminished. Poems speak to us in many ways. Though their forms may not always be direct or narrative, keep in mind that a real person formed the moment of the poem, and it's wise to seek an understanding of that moment. Sometimes the job of the poem is to come closer to saying what cannot be said in other forms of writing, to suggest an experience, idea, or feeling that you can know but not entirely express in any direct or literal way. The techniques of word and line arrangement, sound and rhythm add to, and in some cases multiply, the meaning of words to go beyond the literal, giving you an impression of an idea or feeling, an experience that you can't quite put into words, but that you know is real. All right, time again. Click pause, annotate, and answer your stop and jot. How is reading poetry play? All right, time for the next section, reading a poem aloud. Before you get very far with a poem, you have to read it. In fact, you can learn quite a few things just by looking at it. The title may give you some image or association to start with. Looking at the poem's shape, you can see whether the lines are continuous or broken into groups called stanzas, or how long the lines are, and so how dense on a physical level the poem is. You can also see whether it looks like the last poem you read by the same poet, or even a poem by another poet. All of these are good qualities to notice, and they may lead you to a better understanding of the poem in the end. But sooner or later, you're going to have to read the poem, word by word. To begin, read the poem aloud. Read it more than once. Listen to your voice, to the sounds the words make. Do you notice any special effects? Do any of the words rhyme? Is there a cluster of sounds that seem the same or similar? Is there a section of the poem that seems to have a rhythm that's distinct from the rest of the poem? Don't worry about why the poem might use these effects. The first step is to hear what's going on. If you find your own voice distracting, have a friend read the poem to you. That said, it can still be uncomfortable to read aloud or to make more than one pass through a poem. Some of this attitude comes from the misconception that we should understand a poem after we first read it, while some stems from sheer embarrassment. Where could I possibly go to read aloud? What if my friend hears me? All right, click pause, annotate, and answer the stop and jot. What can you learn from just looking at a poem? What can you learn from reading it aloud? When you're done, click play, and we'll continue. All right, starting where we left off, the line. What determines where a line stops in poetry? There is, of course, more than one answer to this question. Lines are often determined by meaning, sound and rhythm, breath, or typography. Poets may use several of these elements at the same time. Some poems are metrical in a strict sense. But what if the lines aren't metrical? What if the lines are irregular? The relationship between meaning, sound, and movement intended by the poet is sometimes hard to recognize. But there is an interplay between the grammar of a line, the breadth of a line, and the way lines are broken out in the poem. This is called lineation. For example, lines that end with punctuation, called end-stopped lines, are fairly simple. In that case, the punctuation and the lineation, and perhaps even breathing, coincide to make the reading familiar and even predictable. But lines that are not end-stopped present different challenges for readers, because they either end with an incomplete phrase or sentence, or they break before the first punctuation mark is reached. The most natural approach is to pay strict attention to the grammar and punctuation. Reading to the end of a phrase or sentence, even if it carries over one or several lines, is the best way to retain the grammatical sense of a poem. All right, annotate, pause the video, answer the stop and jot, and click play when you're ready to move on. The question is, what is lineation and how is it used? Picking up where we left off. But lineation introduces another variable that some poets use to their advantage. Robert Creeley is perhaps best known for breaking lines across expected grammatical pauses. This technique often introduces secondary meaning, sometimes in ironic contrast with the actual meaning of the complete grammatical phrase. Consider these lines from Creeley's poem, The Language. Locate I, love you some, wherein, teeth and, eyes, bite, it but. Reading the lines as written, as opposed to their grammatical relationship, yields some strange meanings. Locate I seems to indicate a search for identity, and indeed it may. But the next line, which continues with love you some, seems to make a diminishing statement about a relationship. On its own, eyes bite is very disturbing. Hearing Creeley read his poems can often be disquieting, because he pauses at the end of each line, and these pauses create a kind of tension or counterpoint in relation to the poem's sentence structure. His halting, hesitant, breathless style is immediately recognizable, and it presents writers with new ideas about meaning purely through lineation. But many poets who break lines disregarding grammatical units do so only for visual irony, something that may be lost in performance. Among metrical free verse and even experimental poets of today, there are those who do not interrupt grammatical sense when reading a poem aloud as much as they interrupt it in the poem's typography. What to do as a reader? Try a variety of methods. It's fun to Creeleyize any poem just to hear what the lineation is doing. But if the results seem to detract from the poem's impact, it's in terms of its imagery or concept, drop the literal treatment of line breaks and read for grammar or visual image. Reading a poem several ways allows you to see further into the poem simply through repetition. All right, scholars, you have a choice. You can pause and answer your stop and jot. What does it mean to creolise a poem? Why would you do it? Or you can wait. I'm actually going to go back up to the poem and try reading it like they suggest, and then you can answer the question. So either pause now or follow me back up, and we'll read it together. So the first time I read it, I creolised it, and now I'm going to do what they say you can try, which is to read to the grammar, not the lines. So locate, I love you somewhere in teeth and eyes. Bite it, but. Again, a little confusing, but very different. All right, pause, answer the GDQ, and this is your last one. So when you're done, you can head back to the Pear Deck and complete the rest of it for today's lesson. Bye, scholars.